What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my DFS picks for NFL Week 5 Final Look.
These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over each position and break down a couple of my favorite players for this NFL DFS Week 5 main slate. And if you stay to the very end after all my picks and after I show you the Draft Dashboard tools, I'll give you my super secret sleeper pick that no one's talking about. Okay guys, before we get started, I'm going to go over the Week 5 injury report. These are the players that are already marked as out. These are players that I think have significant fantasy impact here in Week 5. Okay, so first, for the Arizona Cardinals, Christian Kirk is out. He's getting 9 targets a game. So that benefits Larry Fitzgerald and David Johnson, who gets a lot of passing targets. From the Cincinnati Bengals, John Ross is out. He gets 8 targets per game. And that's going to benefit Tyler Boyd, who should get the bulk of that extra work. For the Green Bay Packers, Devontae Adams is out. He gets 9 targets a game. That's going to benefit the other Green Bay Packers wide receivers, mostly Geronimo Allison and Marquez Valdez-Scantling. So that's the Week 5 injury report recap. Okay guys, at the quarterback position, I'm really liking Jameis Winston from the Tampa Bay Bucks playing the New Orleans Saints, who give up the second most fantasy points versus opposing quarterbacks. Jameis Winston has been hot. He scored 30 and 33 fantasy points in his last 2 games. He's averaging 21.5 points per game on the season. Most of that has come in the last 2 weeks. He's going to be about 8% owned. He's projected to get 19.3 fantasy points here in Week 5. He's $6,200 DraftKings salary and $1,400 more on FanDuel. So he's got a great matchup. This game is supposed to be close, within 3 points. So we got a competitive game. And Winston will have both of his wide receivers, Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. They're good to go for this week. So I like Jameis Winston here versus the New Orleans Saints. So then coming down in salary a little bit, I like Carson Wentz. He's been solid, 22.2 fantasy points per game on the season. He's $6,100 DraftKings salary. He's $1,700 more on FanDuel, and he's going to be about 9% owned. The only thing that worries me about this play is that the Philadelphia Eagles are favored by 14.5 points over the New York Jets. So if Carson Wentz doesn't score his points in the first half and the game becomes a blowout in the second half, there may not be as much urgency for him to be out there fantasy producing. So just keep that in mind if you're going to play Carson Wentz. A guy a little cheaper, Matt Ryan. This guy's been scoring 23.7 fantasy points per game on the season. He's been super consistent. He's going to be about 13% owned, projected at 19.5 fantasy points here in Week 5. And the reason I like this pick is because Vegas thinks there's going to be 50 points scored in this game, and it's going to be a competitive game. They've got the Houston Texans favored by 4. So look for a lot of Matt Ryan to Julio Jones this game. I think that could be the quarterback wide receiver stack to own here in Week 5. Okay, coming down from Matt Ryan a little bit cheaper, we've got Andy Dalton. Now, play this guy with caution. He was terrible this Monday night. Only put up 6 fantasy points, but now he's got a great matchup versus the Arizona Cardinals, who are the second worst defense overall and give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Andy Dalton has averaged 18 fantasy points per game on the season. He's only going to be about 4% owned, and he's projected at 17.8 fantasy points here in Week 5. He's $5,700 DraftKings salary and $1,800 more on FanDuel. The good news for Andy Dalton is this is a home game, and Vegas thinks there's going to be 47.5 points scored in this game. They've got the Bengals favored by 3. So I like Andy Dalton here versus the Arizona Cardinals. Real quick guys, if you're getting any value from this video, please click that subscribe button and ring that bell notification We put out new daily fantasy football videos every single day. Tons of free content coming your way. Now, we already talked about Kirk Cousins. I think he's a great play down at $5,300 DraftKings salary and $1,500 more on FanDuel. He's facing the Giants here in Week 5, who have the 6th worst defense overall, and they give up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Now, Kirk Cousins hasn't really got it together thus far, so he's the most risky play out of all of these, a tournament play, only going to be about 3% owned. But if he can put a good week together with Adam Thielen, this could be the week that they finally get it clicking in a get-right matchup versus the New York Giants. He's projected at 16 fantasy points here in Week 5. Vegas thinks there's going to be 43.5 points scored in this game, and they've got the Vikings favored by 5. So I like Kirk Cousins as a low-owned, low-salary quarterback. Okay, guys, just a couple more lower-salary quarterbacks that I'm looking at here for Week 5. I like Teddy Bridgewater and Chase Daniel. They both got nice matchups. Teddy versus the Tampa Bay Bucks and Chase versus the Oakland Raiders. These guys haven't been firework quarterbacks yet, but these guys could put up 20 fantasy points, and at their low salary, they could be the play that allows you to fit other studs and other big point scorers in your lineup. Chase Daniel's got a capable Chicago team behind him, and he's a good passer. And Teddy Bridgewater has a lot of offensive weapons with Alvin Kamara and Michael Thomas, and it's a home game for Teddy Bridgewater. So as two value play quarterbacks, if you're trying to fit studs in at other positions, take a look at Teddy Bridgewater and Chase Daniel. Okay guys, it's time to announce the winner of our $100 weekly comment contest. And the winner is Kevin Brooks. Kevin Brooks, congratulations. You are the winner of this week's $100 comment contest. Please reply to our comment to collect your prize. I'm not singing this week, guys. My throat's just not feeling right. But if you didn't win, no worries. You got a chance to win next week. Just keep watching, keep commenting, and next week, it could definitely be you.
Before I continue with the picks, I'm excited today because we added a new contest for everyone watching. If you want to enter the drawing for $100 PayPal, all you need to do is like this video, hit that subscribe button, and make a quick comment below to be entered into the drawing. We'll reply to a random comment and let you know that you won. And then we'll send you $100 PayPal. So it's that easy, and we pick a new winner every Saturday and announce them in our video. So get your comment in now so I can add another entry for you.
Okay guys, let's take a look at the running back position here in Week 5. There's a lot of really good, high-priced running backs this week. We got Christian McCaffrey, Dalvin Cook, Ezekiel Elliott, and one of my favorites, David Johnson, from the Arizona Cardinals, playing the Cincinnati Bengals, who have the 5th worst defense overall and give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing running backs. David Johnson has averaged 18.6 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 19 and 22 fantasy points in his last 2 games. He's averaging almost 12 rushes per game and 7 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 17% owned. He's projected at 19.8 fantasy points here in Week 5. And remember, Christian Kirk is out, so all those targets are going to be spread up between their pass catchers, which includes David Johnson. Vegas thinks there's going to be 47.5 points in this game. They've got the Bengals ahead by 3, so it should be a competitive game. David Johnson should be out there earning fantasy points left and right, so I like David Johnson here versus the Cincinnati Bengals. Another guy who's much lower owned, who I think is going to have a good week, is Le'Veon Bell from the New York Jets, playing the Philadelphia Eagles, who have the 3rd worst defense overall. And yeah, they've been pretty good against running backs so far this year. But Le'Veon Bell is averaging 18.5 fantasy points per game on the season. He's getting an average of 18.7 rush attempts and 7.7 pass targets per game. So that's monster production. He's only going to be about 6% owned. So this is a way to pivot off some of the other higher owned running backs to make your lineup unique. He's on the field for 96% of the snaps, and touches the ball 43% of the time. So monster usage for Le'Veon Bell. He's projected at 17.7 fantasy points here in Week 5. He's only $6,800 DraftKings salary and $500 more on FanDuel. Now, Vegas thinks the Jets are going to be behind by 14.5 points in this game, but Le'Veon Bell is pretty much all they got for their offense. So he's going to be in there no matter if they're up or down. So he'll be in there the whole game earning fantasy points. So I like Le'Veon Bell here versus the Philadelphia Eagles. Careful of Austin Eckler. Melvin Gordon's back, so that's a question mark. I do think he's going to perform a little bit better than a lot of people think. He's projected at 11% ownership, so a lot of people are still going to be playing Austin Eckler. He's got a great matchup, but I think I'm going to shy away from the timeshare there now that Melvin Gordon is back. I'd rather go with a guy like Leonard Fournette from the Jacksonville Jaguars playing the Carolina Panthers, who have a pretty good defense overall, but they give up the 11th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Leonard Fournette has scored 17.5 fantasy points per game on the season. He's getting an average of 18 rushes per game and 5.8 pass targets per game. He scored 30 fantasy points last week. He's going to be about 21% owned. He's on the field for 91% of the snaps, touches the ball 40% of that time. He's projected at 18.1 fantasy points here in Week 5, and he's only $6,400 DraftKings salary, $500 more on FanDuel. This guy's just got a ton of volume week in and week out, so I like Leonard Fournette here versus the Carolina Panthers. Now, looking down to some of the lower salary running backs, I like David Montgomery from the Chicago Bears playing the Oakland Raiders, who have the 4th worst defense overall, and they're middle of the pack defending opposing running backs. David Montgomery got 21 rush attempts last game and 5 pass targets. He's on the field for 55% of the snaps, and he touches the ball 47% of that time. He's going to be about 9% owned, projected at 13.4 fantasy points here in Week 5. Now remember, they got Chase Daniels at the helm because Mitch Trubisky is out this week. So it could be a lot of handing the ball off to David Montgomery. I think it could be a running game script for Chicago, and they've got a nice matchup versus a soft Oakland Raiders defense. So I like David Montgomery as a lower salary running back that can differentiate you from the field. Now moving down even more, I like Miles Sanders from the Philadelphia Eagles playing the New York Jets, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, but they give up the 10th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Miles Sanders has averaged about 8 fantasy points per game on the season. He's getting 11.3 rushes per game and 2.5 targets per game. He's only projected to be 2% owned, projected to score 11.1 fantasy points here in Week 5, but he's only $4,500 DraftKings salary. He's $1,500 more on FanDuel. But this could be a running game script for Philadelphia, who Vegas thinks is going to win this game by 14.5 points. This is a home game for Miles Sanders, and he could get extra work on the ground if this game is a blowout. So I like Miles Sanders here versus the New York Jets.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL, MLB is still going, NBA is right around the corner. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
Okay guys, Week 5, wide receiver position. I think Julio Jones has a huge bounce back week here. He only put up 9 fantasy points last week, but he's averaging 21.2 fantasy points per game. He's averaging 9.3 targets per game. He's going to be about 17% owned, and I love the 50 points that Vegas thinks are going to be scored in this game. With the Atlanta Falcons trailing by 4, This is a huge passing game script for Julio Jones and Matt Ryan. The matchup is pretty decent. The Houston Texans are giving up the 13th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. I just think it's going to be an explosion for Julio Jones this week. But coming down in salary a little bit, I like Mike Evans and Chris Godwin from the Tampa Bay Bucks. Pairing them up with Jameis Winston, or just pairing one of them, I think is a great way to go this week. They both had small little health concerns throughout the week, but they were really nothing. They're both good to go. Chris Godwin has averaged 23.7 fantasy points per game on the season. Mike Evans has averaged 20.5 fantasy points per game on the season. Both of them getting about 8 to 9 targets per game, going to be about 8 to 10% owned. Really similar stats between the two of these guys. So you could go with either one or both if you want to get risky with that Jameis Winston stack. So I like Mike Evans and Chris Godwin here in week 5. A guy right underneath them is Adam Thielen from the Minnesota Vikings playing the New York Giants, who have the 6th worst defense overall and give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Adam Thielen hasn't had a great year so far. He's only averaging 12.3 fantasy points per game on the season, and he only scored 3 fantasy points last week. He's averaging 5.5 targets per game, and he's only going to be about 5% owned. So this is a low-owned player that's got 2 touchdown upside in a great matchup in a game that they want to get the passing game right. So I like Adam Thielen here versus the New York Giants. And right under him, Michael Thomas, maybe one of my favorite plays on the slate for the New Orleans Saints playing the Tampa Bay Bucks, who have the 9th worst defense overall and give up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Michael Thomas is averaging almost 20 fantasy points per game off of 10.5 pass targets per game. The volume is there even without Drew Brees. He's getting it done. He's going to be about 18% owned. He's on the field for 93% of the snaps, and he's touching the ball 17% of the time. So he's a volume monster, way underpriced here at only $6,600 DraftKings salary and $1,100 more on FanDuel. He's projected at 18.6 fantasy points here in week 5. I love this play. I'm going to have a lot of Michael Thomas. Vegas thinks it's going to be a competitive game. 46 points scored in this game. It's a home game, so I love Michael Thomas here versus the Tampa Bay Bucks. And just under him, I like Tyler Boyd from the Cincinnati Bengals playing the Arizona Cardinals, who have the 2nd worst defense overall. Tyler Boyd is in a sweet spot this week. John Ross is out, so Tyler Boyd should get almost all of the targets in this game. He's averaging 14.7 fantasy points per game on the season, and he's already averaging 9.5 targets per game. He's going to be about 11% owned. He's projected at 16.1 fantasy points here in week 5. Fantastic matchup versus the Cardinals. 47.5 projected points in this game. I think Tyler Boyd goes off this week, so I like Tyler Boyd here versus the Arizona Cardinals. Now coming down in salary, don't forget about Larry Fitzgerald. With Christian Kirk injured, Larry Fitz could get a bunch more targets this week, and he's already averaging 9 targets per game on the season, scoring 17.8 fantasy points per game. He's going to be about 12% owned, on the field for 92% of the snaps, touching the ball 14% of the time, projected at 15.6 fantasy points here in week 5. He's only $6,000 DraftKings salary and $200 less on FanDuel. On volume alone, I think you got to get yourself some Larry Fitzgerald here in week 5. And coming down in salary, if you want a low salary wide receiver with a lot of upside, take a look at Philip Dorsett from the New England Patriots playing the Washington Redskins, who give up the 3rd most fantasy points overall, and they give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Philip Dorsett is averaging 13.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting about 6 targets per game. He's only going to be 2% owned, so I think that ownership is way low. He's the guy that got the biggest boost now that Antonio Brown is not there. they're going to continue to get him involved. They've got a great matchup this week versus the Washington Redskins. Tom Brady is going to want to prove a point that last week was a fluke. So look for Tom Brady to hit Philip Dorsett here in week 5. In the last couple guys on my radar, Marquez Valdes-Scantling and Geronimo Allison. Don't forget about those two guys because Devontae Adams is out, so they should get more work this week. Okay guys, week 5, tight end position. There's a lot of pretty good plays here. The ownership is spread out through these tight ends, so I'm just going to kind of go through the ones that I like. I like Evan Ingram, Darren Waller, Mark Andrews, and Austin Hooper as my top 4 tight ends for week 5. These are all guys between $4,500 DraftKings salary up to Evan Ingram, who's $5,800 DraftKings salary. No big time price tags here in week 5, but you've got consistent fantasy producers in these top 4 guys, averaging between 17 and 20 fantasy points per game on the season. All 4 of these tight ends are in play. Darren Waller's got a tough matchup versus the Chicago Bears, but I'm still going to have my fair share of Darren Waller. Mark Andrews has been electric in Baltimore. He's recovering from that injury, so he should be fine and good to go this week. And Austin Hooper, averaging 18.4 fantasy points per game on the season, scored 25 fantasy points in his last 2 games. And that's that game that's projected to have 50 points scored in it. So Matt Ryan, Austin Hooper, Julio Jones, these are guys that I'm going to be targeting here in week 5. Now, coming down in salary, if you want a lower salary tight end, take a look at Greg Olson from the Carolina Panthers playing the Jacksonville Jaguars, who give up the 13th most fantasy points overall, and they give up the 12th most fantasy points to the opposing tight ends. Greg Olson has scored 13.9 fantasy points per game on the season in an average of 7.3 targets per game. His ownership is way down at 4% still, so he's a nice pivot from those other higher owned tight ends we just covered. He's projected at 10.3 fantasy points here in week 5. So I like Greg Olson here versus the Jacksonville Jaguars.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video.
You've unlocked the bonus content. My super secret sleeper pick for week 5. We already talked about this guy, but I just want to emphasize him even more. It's Philip Dorsett from the New England Patriots playing the Washington Redskins. Philip Dorsett is averaging 13.7 fantasy points per game on the season, those 6 targets per game, and he's only going to be about 2% ownership. So super low ownership for a guy that's getting the targets. He's been productive week to week. He's got a fantastic matchup versus this Washington Redskins secondary. He's going overlooked by other people this week. So I know we already talked about him, but believe me, Tom Brady doesn't have back-to-back bad games. He will find his wide receivers this week, so I like Philip Dorsett here versus the Washington Redskins.
Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smiggity smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NFL slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.